Martin didn't think much of his daughter Jess's drawings. At 6 years old, her world was filled with vibrant colors, swirling patterns, and clumsy depictions of houses, animals, and the occasional stick figure family. Her Crayola backpack, brimming with markers, colored pencils, and crayons, was her sanctuary. Hours would pass as she hunched over her makeshift art station in the corner of her room, crafting image after image. Most of them were innocent, the typical output of a child's imagination. But one day, as Martin sifted through the pile of drawings on her desk, a particular picture caught his eye. It was a simple sketch of Jess holding hands with a woman. The odd part? The woman wasn't his wife. Jess's mom had sunny blonde hair, and this woman had deep brown locks. "Jess," Martin asked, holding the drawing up, "who's this?" Jess glanced at it with the nonchalance only a child could muster. "That's Lucia. She visits me sometimes." The word sent a faint chill skittering down Martin's spine, though he wasn't sure why. Children and their imaginary friends, he thought. But something about the name tugged at a distant corner of his mind. "Lucia?" he repeated. "Uh-huh," Jess said, already preoccupied with another sheet of paper. Later that evening, Martin showed the picture to his wife. She frowned at it, tilting her head. "I don't know," she said. "It could be anyone." "Jess said her name is Lucia," Martin added. His wife froze. Slowly her gaze shifted to him, and in that look, Martin saw something he hadn't expected. Recognition. "Lucia was my sister's name," she said quietly. "The one who died." Lucia. The name hit Martin with a weight he hadn't anticipated. His wife rarely talked about her sister. Lucia had died tragically years ago, long before Jess or their younger son were born. "You don't think—" Martin began, but he couldn't finish the sentence. The next day, they gently questioned Jess about Lucia. "She comes at night," Jess said cheerfully, "when I'm drawing." "What does she talk about?" Martin's wife asked, her voice tight. Jess shrugged. "She asks about you and Daddy. She says she likes my drawings." His wife tried to keep her voice steady. "The next time she visits, will you draw her for me?" With more details? Jess nodded happily. That night, Martin and his wife lay awake, straining their ears for any sound from Jess's room. It was past midnight when they heard it, a low murmur, Jess's small voice carrying faintly down the hall. Martin motioned for his wife to follow him. They crept to Jess's doorway and paused. Jess was speaking in fits and starts, long pauses punctuating her words, as if she were responding to someone. "They asked about you when they saw my picture of you," Jess said suddenly. "They want me to draw you again." Martin's wife sucked in a sharp breath. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Jess," Martin said, his voice firm but gentle, "are you talking to Lucia right now?" Jess looked up, her eyes wide with innocence. "Uh-huh," she said, then turned her head toward the far corner of the room. "She's standing right there." Both parents froze, their gazes snapping to the corner. The space was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost charged. A cold, prickling sensation crawled up Martin's neck, though he couldn't say why. "Can you draw her for us now, sweetheart?" his wife asked softly. "Okay, Mom," Jess said. They left the room, the door slightly ajar, their hearts pounding. They sat in the kitchen, saying little, each lost in their own spiraling thoughts. It wasn't long before Jess called them back. "I'm done!" The new drawing was far more detailed than the last. Lucia's figure was sketched with striking precision for a 6-year-old. She had piercing blue eyes, a small mole just above her lip, and was dressed in a flowing white gown. Martin's wife's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is it?" Martin asked, though deep down he already knew. "That's exactly how she looked," she said, her voice trembling. "At her funeral, she wore white, and the mole, Jess has never seen a picture of her. I don't even have one in the house." Martin stared at the drawing, his stomach churning. Jess, oblivious to their fear, simply smiled. Over the next few days, the unease in the house grew. Jess's door was left ajar at night, and her parents listened intently for any signs of conversation. Though they heard nothing, both admitted they felt a strange, almost oppressive presence lingering in Jess's room. Finally, they decided they couldn't take any chances. They called a priest to bless the house. The man walked through each room, murmuring prayers and sprinkling holy water. When he reached Jess's room, he paused, his brow furrowing slightly, but he said nothing. That night, Jess didn't mention Lucha, nor did she the next night or the one after that. Weeks passed without incident, and slowly the family began to relax. Martin still thought about the drawing sometimes, especially late at night when the house was quiet and the shadows seemed longer. He wondered what Lucia wanted, why she had appeared to Jess and not to him or his wife. The priest had assured them the house was cleansed, but deep down, Martin wasn't sure spirits could be so easily banished. Sometimes, as he watched Jess bent over her drawings, he couldn't help but wonder if Lucia might come back, and if she'd bring someone else with her. Mrs. Langley had been teaching for nearly 2 decades. She was no stranger to the joys and sorrows of her profession, but nothing in her years of experience had prepared her for what happened that spring. The activity that day was Draw and Tell, a biannual tradition in her third-grade class. The instructions were simple. The children were to draw something meaningful to them and then share the story behind their art. It was meant to foster creativity and self-expression, and over the years, Mrs. Langley had seen it all. Pictures of beloved pets, favorite vacations, or stick figure families standing under rainbows. It was, more often than not, a light-hearted affair. That afternoon, the classroom buzzed with the scratch of crayons and the soft chatter of children sharing what they were working on. Mrs. Langley moved between the desks, offering praise and encouragement. "Beautiful work, Sarah. Is that your dog, Rufus? I love the spots. Tommy, is that your treehouse? It looks amazing." But when she reached the corner where Alex sat, her steps slowed. Alex was a quiet boy, often lost in his own world. He rarely volunteered to speak in class, and his art usually mirrored his reserved nature. Simple, unassuming drawings. Today, however, was different. His page was a riot of fiery reds, oranges, and yellows. The flames he had drawn seemed to leap from the paper, jagged and chaotic. Mrs. Langley tilted her head, trying to make sense of it. "Alex," she said gently, "what are you working on?" The boy glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not done yet," he said simply, and went back to coloring. She nodded and moved on, but something about the drawing lingered in her mind. When she made her rounds again a little later, Alex's picture had taken shape. The fire was still there, but now it engulfed a house, a small, nondescript structure with a slanted roof and a single door. Mrs. Langley crouched beside him. "Alex, can you come with me into the hallway for a moment?" The other children, sensing something unusual, glanced over but quickly returned to their work when she gave them a firm look. In the hallway, she knelt to meet Alex's eyes, holding the drawing in her hands. "This is very detailed," she began, unsure of how to proceed. "But Alex, I have to ask, why did you draw a house on fire?" The boy didn't hesitate. His voice was calm, matter of fact. "Because that's my house. That's the house my parents tried to burn down with me in it." The words hung in the air, heavy and chilling. Mrs. Langley felt the world tilt slightly. For a moment, she wasn't sure she'd heard him correctly. "Alex," she said carefully, her voice barely above a whisper, "what do you mean by that?" He looked at her, his gaze steady and unflinching. "It happened at night. They told me we were going camping. But when I woke up, there was fire everywhere. I got out through the window." Mrs. Langley's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was disbelief. This was just a story, a child's overactive imagination. But the way he spoke, the quiet conviction in his voice, made her stomach churn. She fought to keep her composure. Did you tell anyone about this before?" Alex shook his head. "No one asked." The simplicity of his answer made her heart ache. She reached out and touched his shoulder. "Alex, I think it's very brave of you to share this with me. I'm going to make sure someone helps you, okay?" He nodded but said nothing more. Back in the classroom, Mrs. Langley struggled to maintain her usual upbeat demeanor. She told the students they would be skipping the tell portion of the activity and instructed them to take their drawings home instead. Most of the children didn't mind. Public speaking wasn't high on their list of favorite things. After class, she went straight to the principal's office. She handed over Alex's drawing, explaining what he had told her. The principal's face darkened as he listened, and he assured her the matter would be handled appropriately. From that point on, Mrs. Langley was kept out of the loop. Confidentiality protocols prevented her from knowing what steps were taken or whether Alex was placed in a safer environment. All she could do was hope that someone, somewhere, had listened to his story and acted on it. The memory of that day stayed with her for years. The image of Alex's drawing, those vivid, angry flames consuming the house, was burned into her mind. She would often lie awake at night, wondering about him. Was he okay? Had he found a place where he could feel safe? And then there were the darker questions, the ones she tried to push away but couldn't always silence. What kind of parents would do such a thing? Was Alex exaggerating? Or had she glimpsed the truth of something too awful to comprehend? She never saw Alex again after that school year, but every time she pulled out the draw and tell assignment for a new class, she hesitated. She couldn't help but wonder what stories were hidden behind the cheerful faces of her students, and which ones might come spilling out, unbidden, onto the page. Brad and Jane considered themselves lucky. Their 5-year-old daughter, Molly, was the kind of child every parent dreamed of: polite, cheerful, and endlessly curious about the world. She rarely fussed and always obeyed her bedtime, which made what happened one night all the more jarring. Molly shuffled into their bedroom, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Her wide, teary eyes glistened in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something in my closet." Brad groaned, half awake. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart. Go back to bed." But Jane sat up, sensing the genuine fear in her daughter's voice. "Brad," she said softly, "just check. It'll only take a minute." Brad sighed, rolling out of bed and following Molly back to her room. The closet door stood slightly ajar, casting a thin, angular shadow across the floor. He flicked on the light, opened the door wide, and peered inside. There were only rows of tiny dresses and a few scattered toys. "See?" he said, pulling out a pink tutu for emphasis. "Nothing here but your clothes. No monsters." Molly hesitated, still gripping her rabbit. "Okay," she mumbled, but her eyes lingered on the closet as Brad tucked her back into bed. The next night, Molly appeared in their room again. This time her face was pale, and her small hands trembled. "It's back," she whispered. "The monster. It's watching me." Jane reached for her daughter, pulling her into bed between them. "You can sleep here tonight," she said, smoothing Molly's hair. Brad was less convinced. "Molly, there's no such thing as monsters. It's just a bad dream." But Jane shot him a look that silenced his protests. The following morning, Molly handed them a drawing she had made. On the page was a crude but unmistakable figure, a tall, hunched silhouette with long, jagged fingers and empty, staring eyes. Its body was bent unnaturally, as if folding into the edges of the paper. "What's this?" Brad asked, frowning. "It's the monster," Molly said simply. Jane exchanged a glance with Brad. "Where did you see this?" "In my closet," Molly said matter-of-factly. Brad wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to an overactive imagination, but something about the drawing unsettled him. The sharp, angular lines gave it a sense of malice that didn't feel like the work of a child. That night, Brad decided to keep the closet light on and left the door open a crack. He even sat by Molly's bed until she drifted off to sleep. Nothing unusual happened, and by the time he went to bed himself, he felt foolish for being so spooked. At 3 a.m., they were jolted awake by Molly's piercing screams. Brad and Jane bolted to her room to find her curled in a ball on her bed, sobbing hysterically. "Molly!" Jane cried, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" Molly pointed a trembling finger at her back. Jane lifted her daughter's pajama shirt and gasped. 2 long, red scratches ran diagonally across Molly's skin, as if raked by claws. "Did you do this to yourself?" Brad asked, though his voice wavered. Molly shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "It was the monster," she sobbed. "It came out of the closet." Brad stormed to the closet, throwing the door open so hard it banged against the wall. He rummaged through the clothes and toys, searching for anything that could have caused the scratches. But there was nothing there. No sharp objects, no sign of an intruder. Nothing. He checked the windows and doors, convinced someone had broken in, but every lock was secure. The scratches were inexplicable. The next day, Brad installed a motion-activated camera in Molly's room. He told her it was there to catch the monster if it came back. Molly seemed comforted, though Jane remained visibly uneasy. That night, they reviewed the footage before bed. At first, there was nothing unusual. Molly shifted in her sleep a few times, the faint sound of her breathing filling the quiet room. Then just past 2 a.m., something flickered on the screen, a shadow moving near the closet. Brad paused the video, his heart pounding. The shadow didn't resemble anything in the room. It was tall and thin, its edges unnaturally sharp, like the figure in Molly's drawing. "What is that?" Jane whispered. Brad didn't answer. He rewound the video, playing the moment again and again, but the shadow remained, a chilling, impossible presence. That night, they moved Molly to the guest room and left the closet door in her room firmly shut. For a while, things seemed to return to normal. Molly still talked about the monster occasionally, but the scratches didn't reappear, and she no longer woke up screaming. Months later, as they were packing to move to a new house, Jane found Molly's drawing of the monster tucked inside a box. She stared at it for a long moment before throwing it away, but the image lingered in her mind. Even in their new home, Molly's closet door was always left open, the light inside kept on at all times. Years later, as an adult, Molly would vaguely remember the monster in her closet. She'd dismiss it as a childhood nightmare, the product of an overactive imagination. But her parents never forgot the scratches, the shadow on the video, or the fear in their daughter's eyes. And sometimes, late at night, Brad would wake up sweating, haunted by the thought that they hadn't left the monster behind at all, that it had simply found a new hiding place.